At this time, I'm going to invite Dr. Bogan to come up, and we are going to have do a little bit more Sankofa work. Remember, Sankofa means to go back and get it and fetch it, examine in the present and move toward the future. And that is exactly the lessons that we are getting from Dr. Bogan. And so we are going to continue to march forward and continue to learn about our Methodist origins. Dr. Bogan?
All right. Thank you, Bishop. Good morning, Louisiana. Good morning. So today we are going to talk about connectionalism. I know y'all are all excited to hear about the history of connectionalism before 9 a.m. So get ready, get your coffee ready. As United Methodists, we hear this word a lot. But what does it mean? Like, seriously, what does it mean? And how does it benefit you as clergy, as laypersons? How does it benefit those who sit in your pews and those who exist in the world outside of your church walls? Well, hopefully this morning we'll kind of get down to some of those benefits. But the answer to these questions is multifold, because connectionalism in and of itself is a multifold concept. So before we dive into its multiple meanings, however, we need some history, right? Some context. Where did connectionalism come from, and what exactly did John Wesley mean by it? So let's go back to that wonderful year of 1739. That same year that John first submitted to be more vile. Now, before John left the town of Bristol, he built a preaching house there. He called this building the New Room, and it still stands and is the first Methodist building in the world. If you are ever in Britain, ever in England, take that chance, take the train. It's about a 2-hour train ride from London, and go see Bristol. It is an awe-inspiring and life-changing moment. So John builds the New Room, and when John left Bristol to head back to London, he doesn't leave this vitality behind. On November 11th of 1739, just a few months later, he preached on the site of a former royal foundry for cannons. A building on this location was revitalized to provide rooms for band meetings, a school, living quarters, guest rooms, a stable, and a space for coaches. This location became the first Methodist preaching house in London. And while it's being built, however, Wesley's reputation and his movement kind of took a hit and experienced its first division. In London, Wesley had been part of a small group known as the Fetter Lane Society. This group was heavily influenced by the Moravians. And after his Aldersgate experience, and especially after Bristol, John began to differentiate himself from the Moravians, specifically over the doctrine of holiness. For John, humanity had a direct role to play in our journey towards holiness. We had agency in this quest and had a duty to seek daily, even hourly, even minute by minute, to put on the mind of Christ and walk out into this world in God's love. Amen? However, some persons with the Fetter Lane Society leaned more towards the Moravian understanding of holiness, an understanding that one received holiness through stillness, by remaining reflective on the love of God and awaiting for God to bestow you with holiness. Now, as a person who I am very bad with mindfulness, like, this actually sounds quite wonderful to be in that moment and feel the Spirit of God come upon you. But it's this subtle difference between the amount of agency we have when it comes to attaining holiness. But it does lead to a division between John's people called Methodist, who believe that we have this duty, this call to seek holiness, and those that believe that we seek holiness by being still and awaiting God. With this break with the Fetter Lane Society and with 2 new buildings, one in Bristol and one in London, John Wesley knew how to figure out how to organize people who agreed with him on the human agency component. But how did he do this? How did he ensure that people were preaching his version of holiness? And how did he do all of this while maintaining his status as a priest within the Church of England? Well, y'all, one of the beautiful things about being a movement inside of an institution is that you get to be creative. You get to bend the rules and challenge the norms, as long as you don't go too far. And that's exactly what John Wesley did. He set up his preaching houses in connection with each other. This meant that only persons who he knew were capable of balancing his evangelical understanding and maintain the doctrines of the Church of England could preach inside of them. These houses also had rather strict rules about what could occur inside their walls. Only preaching and exhorting, only the meetings of classes and bands, and primarily education. Sacraments were not allowed inside of the walls because that would have been a direct violation of the Church of England. But other missions and ministries began to emerge from these centers. But they didn't emerge strictly in the new room or strictly in the foundry. Most of them happened on the roads that connected them. These 2 early Methodist sites talked with one another. They learned from one another. They shared preachers. They financially supported each other. And they joined together in mission. And as the preachers journeyed back and forth between these sites, they began to establish other preaching houses, other mission posts along the way. They began to create a ministry connected in mission. And this system worked. Methodism grew because it was connected. Remember in the talk a couple days ago, I laid out how England was changing during the Industrial Revolution, and all of the support systems that people had in place and had relied on were no longer there. This is where that connection, that physical missional outpost came in handy. It provided that support. It literally connected people together to help each other out at a time when their prior support systems were no longer in place. Wesley was able to conceive of connectionalism in a world that was turned upside down by the Industrial Revolution and massive migration. He developed new ways of bringing together old and scattered ideas. And our ability to innovate this type of discipleship is at the core of what it means to be Wesleyan. So now that we have a little bit of context as to what's going on in Wesley's life when connectionalism emerges, let's do that deep dive into its various meanings. It is first and foremost a theological concept. For an illustration of this, let's turn again to John Wesley's 1750 sermon on Catholic spirit. Now, this sermon is written about 1 decade after his fallout with the Fetter Lane Society, and after many failed attempts to bring persons together who used to follow Wesley, but were beginning to stray into different ideologies of theology. It wasn't just the Moravian concept of stillness that divided these early Methodists, but also the concept of predestination. Now, John Wesley believed that Christ died for all persons, no exceptions. However, during this era, others were influenced by the theology of George Whitefield. George Whitefield was influenced by the theology of John Calvin. John and George knew each other from their days at Oxford, right? George is one of the people who is an original member of the Holy Club. And George Whitefield was known for his preaching style. He famously travels back and forth between England and the British colonies. He traveled up and down the eastern seaboard of the British colonies, and quite famously even made Benjamin Franklin shed a tear and put a penny in the coffer. However, George Whitefield, while he was Methodist in mission, upheld the doctrine of predestination, the idea that Christ died not for all, but only for a select few. Now, Whitefield and Wesley debated endlessly over this difference. This is why I often refer to them as frenemies. They agreed on mission and on the needs of classes, societies, and bands to support and develop communities. But on who is saved through Christ, they differed. So throughout the 1740s, John is trying to reconcile with various persons who had long influenced his faith, but were refusing to meet with him in what he called Christian conference. And thus we get the sermon titled Catholic Spirit. This really, I like to think of this as a reflective piece, maybe a piece that John writes in his journal to help him think through this difference and this reconciliation. In this piece, Wesley is trying to lay out ways for groups who differ in theological opinions or modes of worship to still come together, to walk hand in hand in the love of Christ. Before I read a section from this sermon, I want us to think about how in 2023 we do relate so much to Wesley's day. We've been trying to figure out, how do we hold United Methodism together in the midst of difference as to who is and who isn't worthy of God's love? But if you take nothing else from today's talk and the other day's talk, take this. John Wesley and true Wesleyan Methodism holds that all persons are worthy of the love of God, unconditionally, without change of how God made them, who they love, how they identify, no exceptions. The debate that United Methodism has been having for the last 10, 20, 50, 200 years is the very debate that John Wesley and George Whitefield were having. We just have to be willing to hold strong to Wesley. Now hear these words. But although a difference in opinions or modes of worship may prevent an entire external union, yet need it prevent our union in affection. Though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart, though we are not of one opinion. Without all doubt we may. Herein all the children of God may unite, notwithstanding these smaller differences. These remaining as they are, they may forward one another in love and in good works. Those within United Methodism and those outside of it need this message today. The United States landscape today is one of the most politically, socially, theologically divisive ones in United States history. Families are being torn apart due to difference in opinions on a whole host of things that I'm not going to get into. You're welcome. But United Methodism isn't necessarily protected from this. It too is being torn apart through a diversity of opinions and modes of worship. However, Wesley dares to remind us what it means to be connectional. You and I may differ on exegesis, on theology, even on the best form of mission. But can we join hand in hand and walk together out into this world to spread the love of God? Now, connectionalism is also a communal and a practical concept. As historian Russell Ritchie argues, Methodist theology is embedded in our practicality. Wesleyan theology was built upon how Wesley brought people together. His brilliance was the band, the class, and the society, which proactively responded to drastic social change. And he didn't stop there. When he saw needs change, Wesley knew how to adapt his system time and time and time again. He connected layers of communities together around accountability and ensured that they had each other's backs and were willing to listen to one another, but more especially to love one another. According to Wesley, quote, Christianity is essentially a social religion, and that to turn it into a solitary religion is indeed to destroy it. When I say this is essentially a social religion, I mean not only that it cannot subsist so well, but that it cannot subsist at all without society, without living and conversing with other persons, end quote. In order to live into our faith, we have to be in community with one another. In this sense, connectionalism uplifts those who seek to bridge communities and support diverse needs. Here in Louisiana, y'all have some amazing examples of persons who have expanded connectionalism through community building. I want to take a brief moment before I dive into some local history to thank the Louisiana Annual Conference archivist, Chris Brown. For providing me with stories and images and biographies of these incredible persons who have done mission and ministry in, through, and around this conference. So thank you, Chris. So let's look at Hester Williams to start. Known as Aunt Hester, she was a former slave who herself had little formal schooling. And yet, she managed to begin multiple schools throughout Louisiana. In 1882, she addressed the Louisiana Conference and presented them with a challenge. She brought with her $14. Money that she had saved from selling eggs and sugarcane. And she challenged the conference to match her funds in order to build schools. This is connectionalism at work. Yesterday, we saw connectionalism at work in this room. Y'all did something quite similar to Aunt Hester when we raised, how much money? $17,000 within 30 minutes to help relieve Louisiana Methodists from this heat that y'all have got going real hard down here. I never thought I'd be so excited to get back to New Jersey, but it is 70 degrees there. Just saying. And Aunt Hester did not stop with her request to the Louisiana Conference. She kept using the connectional system to build communities through education. A few years later, she traveled up to Detroit to speak at the annual meeting of the Women's Home Missionary Society, where she again challenged them to raise funds for schools here in Baton Rouge. They gave her $200, which she used to start 5 schools, adding to the already 7 she had started. She did all of this traveling by horse, wagon, foot, mule, train, boat, and probably a lot of Holy Spirit. She used the connection not to her advantage, but to the glory of God, to ensure that others had opportunities that she had not been given. Connectionalism is also a political and an ecclesiological idea. As John Wesley toured England spreading his message of God's unconditional love of and for all, he found himself being locked out of certain parishes. He was no longer being welcomed into the institutional church because he dared to challenge it. He constantly critiqued the Church of England for not meeting the needs of those outside the walls. and he was not shy in proclaiming that his movement was meeting their needs. And yet, he was loyal to the very entity he critiqued. When other Methodists heard this critique, they were tempted to leave the Church of England. But time and time and time again, John encouraged them to stay, because change only comes from the inside, from those who are willing to be the movement inside the institution. A great example of this is in 1742. John returned to his childhood home of Epworth, and he immediately goes to St. Andrew's Parish, the parish where Susanna Wesley famously critiqued Inman, the curate, for being a buffoon, the parish where John Wesley was baptized and raised, where he was nurtured in his faith. And he asked the current curate there if he could assist with the morning service, and he's turned away. However, as usually happens when a lot of us go home, word got around that John was in town, and people showed up to hear him. What they heard instead was the curate preaching against John Wesley's enthusiastic form of religion. And the curate continued by laying out the ways that the Spirit of God should work in us, all of which was antithetical to what John believed the Spirit of God capable of doing in us. After the service, John spread the word that he'd be preaching that evening, and around 6 p.m., still forbidden to enter the doors of St. Andrew's, John stood atop his father's grave just outside the east end of St. Parish's church and preached his message of unconditional love. John thrived at holding in tension, in connection, his ability to critique and support the denomination he called home. Now, today probably isn't the day to do this, but I'm sure we've all got a few critiques for the United Methodist Church we call home. But I also know that we are all still here, committing to staying United Methodists. And it is our job from here on to hold together that tension, just like John did. And this is one of the beautiful things that connectionalism affords us. We can offer critique, hope for reform, all while still walking hand in hand in the love of God. And if we literally take a page from Wesley's playbook, critiquing the institution is the best way to help it change for the better. The United Methodist Church of 2023 is an institution in dire need of some movement. And all of us who are gathering during this annual conference season as those who are committed to staying and to helping the Spirit of God move through this conference, move through this denomination, through our polity, move through and allow for a little bit of wiggle room so that we can breathe in God and breathe out love. When John Wesley sanctions the beginning of a separate ecclesiological tradition called the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1784, it was under the assumption that Methodists in America would stay in connection with him, would still continue to view him as a primary leader or their primary guide. And minus an intentional omission in 1787, they did. From the beginning, Methodists maintained a sense of identity across oceans. But Methodism worked differently in the newly founded United States than it had in Britain because it had to. And as Methodism spread around the world, it held certain tenets and systems in common. It was connected not only theologically, but missionally, financially, and politically. Once again, the idea of connectionalism in this sense was a balancing act. For how do you allow for a separate ecclesiology to form while continuing in mission and ministry together? Today, how do we allow for creative ministries in different regions of the world while holding firm to our connective witness? Now, another way to think about connectionalism as a political concept is to think about SEC football. Now, this analogy might be a bit of a stretch, but stick with me. I was born and raised in Arkansas. I went to the University of Arkansas. I am what will and always will continue to be a Razorback. However, I am in Baton Rouge, and I've heard there's a school around here. I stand before you today, maybe only today, willing to walk hand in hand in the love of football with you Tiger fans. For though we may root for different teams, we can go out and hope that we both beat Alabama. I know, a bit of a stretch, but at least I know y'all are listening still. And finally, connectionalism is a missional and a ministerial concept. Mission is at the heart of what it means to be Methodist. John Wesley did not devise a new system of theology. His ingenuity was his ability to design systems of mission. He was able to provide rather readily places and spaces that met the basic needs of people. His preaching houses weren't just rooms where people gathered to hear a sermon. They were mission posts. They were libraries. They were medical dispensaries. They were places for trade. They were places to gather and sip tea together. They were places for people to organize, to go out into the world. And they functioned as lodging for anybody in need of it. They were also the financial centers of the connection. Each class that was planted was expected to contribute a certain financial amount back to the preaching house. These funds were then collected together and distributed equitably to support traveling preachers, bishops, and new preaching houses. All of the income generated from the sales of Bibles, of tracts, of sermons, of John Wesley busts, of trinkets and hymn books, all of it went back to the connection to fund the overall ministry and missions of the people called Methodist. If you don't know where I'm going with this, this is where we got our apportionment system. It is the financial foundation of connectionalism. So many people today see apportionments as a burden, as a tax. But y'all, it's how when we gather on Sunday mornings, anywhere in the world, contribute to and financially support and stay missionally connected with Methodist mission around the world. The apportionment system allows every single dollar you put in the collection plate to be used in an incredibly effective and efficient manner to do good and make real change. It supports not only the upkeep of the physical church buildings and the salaries of the staff, but through the apportionment system, there's work that many of us probably don't even know is going on. You support the ministry of memory that we do at the General Commission on Archives and History. Your dollars preserve the documents of our past so that we can build our future on an informed understanding of our heritage. Your dollars support the work of UMCOR and its natural disaster relief. It ensures that women and persons of color have a place, space, and voice at all of our tables in countries across the world. It ensures that our social witness is carried out through political advocacy in countries across the world. And ensures that we have Methodist publications in order to enhance discipleship making. It supports hundreds of Methodist colleges, universities, and seminaries globally. All of this automatically happens through the genius of the apportionment system. Other denominations, other independent congregations have to find their own ways to financially contribute to the betterment of the world around us. But as Methodists, because of our connectional nature, it happens automatically because we are bound together in mission. And we aren't only bound together in mission, but in ministry. The itinerancy connects us. Persons who are set apart for ordained ministry belong not to the local church, but to the conference. Here they agree to serve anywhere that God calls them or anywhere that their particular gifts might be best lived out. Our itinerant ministry is at the heart of our connection. And through it, we ensure that congregations are not centered upon the personality of a preacher, but on the mission, ministry, and witness lived out by the laity. Itinerancy began as a practical and proactive way to spread the Methodist movement across vast landscapes at a really rapid pace. One of the stories that I've learned on this trip is about one of the first, if not the first, circuit rider to enter Louisiana. Thomas Nixon arrived in Louisiana around 1816 and wrote in his diary, "I came through a vast prairie in which I got lost and wandered about a long time. And I came to a big coulee full of floating alligators." Now, y'all, I love Jesus. But if I came to a coulee of alligators, I might turn around. I would take it as a sign from the Holy Spirit that maybe I should be going the other way. But he didn't. And there are stories after stories of circuit riders braving all sorts of weather, of natural conditions, of animals, of persons on the road, and they kept going. The faith, the calls to ministry, the drive of these early circuit riders is truly and fully awe-inspiring. And the system worked. The itinerancy literally connected together communities who had no idea of what it meant to have or be a neighbor. And as the circuit riders and itinerant preachers traveled their 250-mile circuits on a horse, the itinerancy empowered the laity. It gave the voiceless voice. It gave women, persons of color, enslaved persons a place to organize, to communicate, to be seen, to be worthy, and to make a difference in their communities. And this is why it spread fast. It's not only the circuit riders and the itinerancy, it's that it's a bottom-up, a grassroots movement of empowerment. It put the heart of mission and ministry in the hands of those in the pews and ensured that the preacher functioned as an occasional speaker and as a guide in mission and ministry. Now, our itinerant system has changed a lot over the last 200 years. As circuit riders became local preachers, as preaching houses became brick churches, as societies became Sunday schools, all of this meant that a local hierarchy begins to replace kind of the equitable nature that we see in early Methodism. So how do we in 2023 think about itinerancy? How do we reclaim it? How do we itinerate in new ways? Both of my parents were ordained clergy persons, and they both served in ministry together in one church for 20 years. They were not necessarily itinerant in function, but they were still connectional. So how do we hold those two in tension? It may no longer be practical to move clergy every single year or to have clergy on the road constantly. But the function of itineracy remains. How do we ensure that the mission of the church isn't relegated to the desires of preacher, but is found in the love shared by those that call that church home? How do we continue to create disciples of Jesus Christ that can thrive in the Methodist witness no matter who is preaching in their pulpits? How do we form new types of circuits? I'm thinking digital circuits, virtual circuits. I'm sure Todd's ears are perking up when I virtual reality circuits. How do we itinerate globally through virtual networks of faith? Overall, connectionalism is at the heart of what it means to be Methodist. It is the product of these grounds-up, grassroots needs that are met over and over again in order to sustain mission. Now that we've kind of looked at the different ways connectionalism works, I want to provide us with a historic example of how I see it working in some of its best form. For context, our current general agency structure didn't come out of nowhere, but emerged from various types of organized mission work that was ongoing and growing quite rapidly. For example, many of the roots of our general agencies actually exist in women's organizations and women's missions, and through a deeper dive into their history, we can get a better look at how the facets of connectionalism are bound and interwoven together. One of my favorite Methodist history books examines the work of Methodist women at St. Mark's in New Orleans. I want to read a bit of an overview of this work that its author, Ellen Blue, provides us. Quote, Methodist women have been responsible for ministries of St. Mark's since 1895, when the local women's societies assumed control of an already extant but failing mission on Chapatoulas Street. Y'all can credit Chris for that. Where city missionary Lily Meekins served the poorest residents of the city's Irish Channel section. Over the next 2.5 decades, Methodist women nurtured that struggling outpost into a thriving ministry. It was in 1909 that the women first expanded their work into the French Quarter, establishing a settlement house that served Italians and white immigrants from 24 other nations. Additional expansions, changes of names, and changes of location occurred before 1923, when the women opened the facility at 1130 North Rampart, that was widely considered the finest settlement house in the South, and where both black and white New Orleanians were openly served in its health clinic. Margaret Ragland, the first Methodist deaconess to serve St. Mark's, was assigned in 1909, and deaconesses continued to run the facility until Faye Daves retired in the mid-1960s. When Katrina made landfall in August 2005, St. Mark's still occupied that same building and still provided some of the same types of services to disadvantaged residents of New Orleans. It was no longer a true settlement house, but still provided the vital services for its neighbors. Now, examining the ministries of deaconesses historically and today is a great way to nuance the purpose of connectionalism. These women were not clergy. They were not ordained or licensed to preach. They were laywomen who followed a call and were consecrated as a deaconess. They were not doing mission inside the church walls, but in the hearts of some of the lowest income neighborhoods. Officially, the office is created in 1888 by the Methodist Episcopal Church and 1902 by the Methodist Episcopal Church South. The women who served St. Mark's were most likely trained at Scarrett Bible and Training School in Nashville, Tennessee. Both denominations recognized the mandate, quote, to minister to the poor, visit the sick, pray with the dying, care for the orphans, seek the wandering, comfort the sorrowing, and save the sinning. And y'all, this is exactly the type of mandate of faith lived out as love that John Wesley was ridiculed for in his Oxford days. The deaconesses and so many other women transgressed social, gender, and racial norms of their day by not marrying, by living among, working alongside, and learning from some of the poorest of the poor and some of the dirtiest neighborhoods across the world. And I hope by now, y'all, that this mentality is sounding familiar and you're thinking, those women were being vile. They were living into that Wesleyan vitality. And they were fortunate enough to have the support of that connectional system undergirding their vitality. Through financial support, through new platforms, educations, trainings, and vast resources, the Methodist Connection supported these women. After the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and the Methodist Protestant Church reunited in 1939, but along segregationist lines, Black and white women, neighbors divided by jurisdiction and by annual conference, finally and formally began to walk hand in hand in mission, advocacy, and protest. In a more recent article, Ellen Blue wrote the following: "More importantly, today's women could draw inspiration from their foremothers. Those women learned that tiny amounts of money saved from housekeeping allowances could be pooled and managed efficiently to accomplish large feats. They perfected strategies of collaborative leadership in an era when a lady was expected to have her name in the newspaper only 3 times: on her birth, marriage, and death. And there was a limit as to how powerful any one woman could be perceived without losing the place in society which enabled her controversial projects to succeed." The work of these women here in Louisiana at the turn of the 20th century embodied connectionalism in its finest form, and we have so much to learn from them. It is my hope that we, as the United Methodist Church, take a page from our own history books and learn to re-embrace connectionalism as a vital and core aspect of what makes us unique, of what makes our witness in this world possible, and how we can continue to walk hand in hand in the love of God. From John Wesley to Mary Bosanquet Fletcher, to the work of these deaconesses right here in Louisiana, our stories are connected because our faith is connected. From the stories we heard yesterday of Anita and Rhonda looking for a new place to feel welcome and to continue to welcome all, they knew to look for an extended hand and found it at Covington United Methodist Church because we are connected. Y'all showed your connectional spirit when you responded immediately to the need for air conditioning, also by Covington. We are a connectional people, and it's time that we proudly reclaim and proclaim this identity. Our church wasn't built brick by brick, dollar by dollar. It was built hand in hand. It spread through the relatively small, connected communities of faith who lived out their faith in love, and that love spread like wildfire. Now, I want to leave you all with some futuristic theology. Bishop Cynthia Fierro Harvey is currently serving as the president of the General Commission on Archives and History, and I know you all here are familiar with her wonderful witness in this connection. I had the joy to attend the Texas Annual Conference a couple weeks ago, and in her opening Episcopal address, she read a poem about connectionalism, one that was written by none other than ChatGPT. Let us now listen to the robots. The United Methodist Connection, a network of faith and love, bound together in devotion to the grace of God above. From cities to rural towns, from shores to mountain peaks, the connection spans the earth, a web of faith that never sleeps. Each heart a vital part in the body of Christ we share, a family of diverse souls with a common bond of prayer. We strive to live with open hearts, to serve and love our neighbors near, to offer hope and healing light, and conquer hate and fear. The United Methodist Connection, a vibrant force for good, uniting hearts and hands and minds in a mission understood. So let us go and spread the love that Christ has given us all and build a world of peace and hope where every heart can stand tall. Amen.